Well, thank you everybody for coming. My name is Zach Mallon. I'm the director of the Nehalem Bay Watershed Council. Um, but you're not here to hear me speak, so I'm going to pass it over to our Vice Chair, Will Russell, to do an introduction. Will, take it away.
Thanks, Zach. First off, Gordy, thanks so much for being here and putting a talk together. The inspiration for this is Gordy came up with really nice enough last year to come up and speak to an environmental studies class from Reed that I hosted at the house last winter, and it was just such a really a good synthetic view of evolution of fish and landscape dynamics that I wanted it to be shared more widely, and I wanted to get a recording of it eventually. Gordy has a long career. He started out working on steelhead and sediment years ago, and quickly started focusing on habitat. He's worked from Northern California to Alaska. Um, he and Dave Hankin developed, I think, Gordy, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the first widely used stream survey methods that was applied again and again over large areas that yielded a lot of valuable insight over the years. Um, Gordy's been attacked by congressmen, senators, any number of people who disagree with him, and actually brown bears. He has the scars to prove it. His the extent of his field work is kind of mind-boggling. And he was when I met Gordy, he was at Aquatic Lands Interaction, and he's one of the real architects of this extraordinary interdisciplinary collaboration that happened in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s and later at the Forest Service Research Station there. And Gordy was like a sort of a shepherd visionary who created space for a lot of different things to happen and created the resources. And for all of you who are involved in watershed work, you probably know about something called NetMap and these extraordinarily robust tools we have. I don't think they would exist in anything like their current form if it weren't for Gordy's collaboration, vision, support, and participation in that process. He's had dozens and dozens of grad students over the year, hundreds of papers, I think. And Gordy, just thanks again for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time.
All right. Well, thanks, Will. Hey, and I just wanted to say one thing. You notice there's no affiliation with my name on the title. Uh,
Yes.
Will said I work for the U.S. Forest Service Research, which is probably going to go by the wayside here shortly, I would guess.
Oh,
Fortunate. But at the PNW Research Station in Corvallis, and was there during probably the golden age of Forest Service research, and was incredibly lucky to spend 37, 38 years there, and then retired in 2018, worked for OSU for a while, helping with the uh, development of the Elliott State Research Forest, and are now working for Department of State Land on the same issue. So all of the things, very nice things that Will said about me, I want to just say one thing. The one that is absolutely true is I was charged by a brown bear. And this is actually the skull of the bear, the woman who shot the bear, and that's Dave Hankin, who was attacked by a second bear while I was being attacked by the first bear. So we were extremely lucky to survive the whole thing. The bear was shot literally while my arm was in the bear's mouth, just like that. So that part of Will's story is true. Okay, what I want to do is just quickly look at where we're at with regard to the freshwater ecology and habitat of anadromous fish. And I think there's a small enough group here that if people have a question, just why don't we just make it so you can just ask it at the time and not if you want to and not wait till the end and we can have some interaction that way. But if we look at the Pacific Northwest and we think about fish and you compare it to other parts of the world, we're really in an area that is incredibly depopulated in terms of the number of species of fish. I mean, you see here, we look at a six order stream here in the Northwest where we might find 20 species. That's compared to an order of magnitude more if you were back east. Now, there's a number of reasons for this, but this doesn't really tell the story about what fish are doing in here in the Northwest. It's they're primarily anadromous. Um, I don't have to explain this cycle. I mean, everybody knows it, but the predominant species here in the Northwest and elsewhere on the West Coast are anadromous. And one of the reasons for this is that we've got, if you think about our freshwater habitat, the productivity of our freshwater habitat is relatively low. In fact, if you compare Northwest streams, their productivity to streams, across the country or in the world, is notoriously low. And so, in order for fish to really persist in this environment, they've got to go somewhere where it's more productive to get large and reproduce, and that's the ocean. Hence, that's the reason why we see the dominance of anadromous species in the Northwest. But if we look at the distribution of these fish, we find them everywhere in the stream network. Okay, from the very headwaters with it will steelhead, rainbows, and cutthroat, and then the middle portions of the network we get into coho and chinook down lower, and chums and pinks in there. And if you look at this, what's really interesting is this basically is the evolution of the genus Oncorhynchus. We start with fish that are completely dependent on, quite dependent on fresh water to complete their life cycle, to fish that are only dependent on fresh water for reproduction. And if you look at in an evolutionary sense, this is pretty much the evolutionary tree. So you can see that the fish are trying to spend less and less time in fresh water and more dependent on the marine environment. Okay, one of the things that we see, and this is not anything new for this group, is these fish populations are in trouble. This is just a slide that we had from the Northwest Forest Plan back in the Clinton administration in the early 90s. There were three species listed. The only anadromous, the only Pacific salmon was the Chinook in the Sacramento River. And now we've got populations of the or ESUs of salmon listed across the landscape. So it's pretty pervasive in terms of that listing. What I want to do is I want to sort of play off this quote from Einstein about saying about the significant problems we face today cannot be solved with the same level of thinking that we were at when we created them. And I think it's important for us periodically to call a time out and say, how are we really thinking about the problems we're facing, these challenges? What are the assumptions we're making? Oftentimes they're unarticulated. We don't talk about them, or we don't even recognize them. And we call a time out and say, okay, is that really the right way to approach it, or do we have new knowledge that suggests we can go in a different way? Okay, if you look at this is just an example for coho and the Oregon coast. I want to look at um, not at where we are currently, but what is the thing you noticed about historically is that things were not stable, quote, in the good old days. Both the number of recruits and the number of spawners were highly variable. And you say, okay, wait a minute, the good old days were not stable. They were actually, quite variable. We had, good years and bad years. And, we've just that's just ratcheted down. We still see these good years and bad years. But the point is, things were not stable. It was not, where you could walk across the back of every salmon, across the back of salmon in every stream back when. That's a myth. In fact, by our best guesses, we would guess, and I'll show you some of why, but we guess only about 60% of the of coho habitat up and down the coast was productive at any point in time. At other point, and that remaining 40% was either in a really old state, it hadn't been disturbed for a long time, or was a newly disturbed state. But things were not stable. I think that's an important thing for us to recognize, that this is in a dynamic environment that these fish are persisting in. And one of the reasons is for the dynamics in the ocean is just these currents, the 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 um, the location of uh, the subarctic boundary here that moved up and down depending on a whole suite of conditions, you know La Nina, El Nino, the type of thing. We these fish are 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 having to um, persist in a very dynamic and somewhat unpredictable environment. Okay, and we say how that was on the on the ocean side, but here's the terrestrial side. The landscape was not stable. It was highly dynamic. It was, and this was premised upon, you look at those first four figures, the darker the green, the older the forest, and um, you can see that the landscape, this is coastal Oregon, was not stable through time. It was actually a very dynamic mosaic of conditions. And so our assumption that everything was fine everywhere is was probably a false assumption. And I think it's something that we really need to look at more closely. I don't want to go into all the gory details here, but I would argue the reason we have this perspective and we're unable to, think about it in this way from an aquatic perspective. You think about the two basic, the tenets that we use, uh, to help us think about aquatic ecosystems. There's the river continuum, and there's the Rosgen channel classifications. The thing that is lacking in both the river continuum and the Rosgen is there's no concept of time. They predict that there should be an ideal state for river systems, both from a physical and a biological uh, perspective. The river continuum looked at it on sort of longitudinally and says, okay, we should have this type of conditions in the upper system, the middle system, the lower. Rosgen just says if you got this channel type, you have these conditions. We don't have a concept of time, and absent a concept of time, you can't think about change. And I think that's a really important thing that we need to recognize as we start to think about how do we move forward into the future. Okay. Okay, I want to show you about change. This is some work we did in Elk River, and it was an outgrowth of the Hankin and Reeves surveys that Will talked about. And what you want to do is this is the scale at which we looked at the river system. Now, what we did is we walked about 70 kilometers, what's that, sort of 50 some miles of stream every year, and we counted every piece of wood in that 70 kilometers. Okay. And this is how it plays out if you bin it by these different scales. And usually, we're thinking, we talk about, well, we want to go to a reach, and a kilometer, a tenth of a kilometer would be 100 meters, so roughly the size of a football field. Um, and what do you see here? You don't see stability. You see a lot of variability annually and within and spatially. So these systems are not being, they're not stable. The habitat elements are not stable. They're highly variable. And we don't, this is just information we're just starting to get into that suggests that things are different than we expect. Now, this is going to be hard to see, but the long and short of this is the fish track that wood. The fish are actually, particularly the older, Omicas, the age one, and the Chinook, actually follow that wood. Then so they're ebbing and flowing up and down the river, depending on where this wood is found. And so the fish are actually able to track these elements that are changing on a relatively and consistently changing, the fish are able to track that and follow that. And what this suggests is, that if we think, well, if we put wood in one place, we'll be in good shape. The fish will be there. The fish are, and they may be there, but the habitat is not stable. The habitat that we're trying to emulate or replicate is not stable. It's highly dynamic. And this is just, this didn't include it. There's a 100-year flood in here in about the middle of this that disrupted everything. But the point being is the fish are able to track these changes. Okay. Here's some work of Daniel Schindler from the University of Washington and Bristol Bay. And you look at it, you look at Bristol Bay as a whole and the major river systems and the stream. Now, if you want a pristine system, this is a pristine system. And what do you notice? It isn't stable. That the returns, particularly, at the stream and the major river levels, are highly variable year to year. The total numbers are relatively stable, but the distribution the within the basins changed dramatically. And this is again, this is something where the um, if you were looking for a pristine environment, this is it. So the pristine environments are not stable. And one of the interesting things, this is the work of a student of Daniel Sean Brennan. Um, he was looking at where fish production occurred in the Nuchagak, the river system. Okay, and so the top one is Chinook, and that dark line, that dark red line, the darker the line, the greater the productivity from that particular part of the system in a given year. Look, it's not consistent. 2011, it's over there to the in the middle portion of the basin, and then look, in 14 and 15 it shift, and then there's some parts of it that were highly productive in one year, not in another. Similar to what we see, not quite as variable, but a lot of dynamics going on with sockeye. And so the fish are not how the fish use the basin is not stable. It's moving around and it's really quite dynamic. Okay, well, how do fish adapt to this? How are they adapted? Well, there's a couple ways. The idea they're highly flexible in terms of their genetics. So they've got a capacity to adapt to a wide range of condition. But straying, we think about straying as usually a maladaptive trait, that we don't assume that these fish stray. That if they do, that there's an issue, and the idea that the fish that are spawned in a given stream return to that stream, to that particular, the dogma about they return to the stream and spawn in the same areas that their parents spawned in, and so on and so forth. Well, there's a certain fraction of the fish that do, but 25, in some cases, upwards of 25 or 30% of the fish do not return to the same stream. They end up somewhere else. And think, why is that? Well, if you're in a very dynamic environment, and you're trying to persist as a population, you can't keep going back to the same place, because at some point it's not going to be productive. And so this idea that we labor under, this illusion that we labor under, that that straying is a maladaptive trait, is not necessarily true, and it's something I'll address here a little bit later. But the fish have high fecundity. They're really capable of colonizing an area and quite quickly because of their fecundity. But this is what I want to emphasize. It's just not the adults, it's the juvenile. And life history diversity is really key to this persistence in these highly dynamic environments. And we look at these life cycle models, of fish. Just two examples. what do you see? There's one thing that the fish do. They all, return to spawn. They die, the fish leave, they come back. Okay, that's the story. This is not this life cycle of salmon. The life cycle of salmon and the beauty of these fish and the strength of these fish in these environments is that diversity, both in terms of strain and life history diversity. And what we should be focusing on, I would argue, for conservation is creating a landscape in which these traits of that the fish have for persisting in dynamic environments can be expressed. Okay. We look at fish we look at fish throughout the distribution range, just as coho. Historically, 10,000 years ago, there weren't any fish north of the Olympic Peninsula. There were this was all covered in ice. And you ask yourself, in 10,000 years, man, these fish have done quite well. They've managed as a new environment has become um, available. They've managed to exploit it, and so again, the basic the beauty of these fish is not that they have this high fidelity and so on and so forth. The fact is they are really quite adapted at being able to colonize areas and need the entire landscape to persist. Um, so just want to give you some examples. This is some work we did in the Copper River Delta, looking at sockeye. Now this is an area, um, what would you say, Will? 3 or 4 times bigger than the Nehalem, um, in total area. Anyhow, there are,
Are you talking about the Delta overall?
yeah,
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's an enormous place with, yeah.
yeah. Anyhow, there were 13 different life history types of sockeye in the in on the Copper River Delta. And they went, from fish that spent, were 2 years old when they returned to fish that were 6 years old. And one of the interesting things is you notice that even within amongst these all the various river systems, there were some life histories that were really common and others that were not. And so you've got this pattern of a lot of this of these in these landscapes of high amounts of life history diversity. Okay, here's an example from Elk River, down on the south coast of Chinook, and this is just some work we did with a smolt trap. Each one of these circles represents a different life history type. If you're familiar with Paul Reimer did some really nice research back in the late 70s with Jim Hall, um, where he looked at these life history types, and they went from fish that were, basically pink salmon. They spent a brief amount of time in freshwater and then moved to the estuary, to ones that spent a whole year. Now these are, quote, fall Chinook, okay, which are, ocean type fish. But look at what you see, and the thing that Paul was able to discern here, in any one year, in any one cohort that returned, it was dominated by one of these life history types. In some years, the life history type 2 or 3 might dominate. The next year it might be 4 or 1. But the idea is it was never consistent. It always the one life history type always dominated. But what happened is then the offspring from those fish produce all of these life history types, which is a really cool strategy. That you're sort of bet hedging your way through time here by saying, well, we don't know what things are going to be like, and so we're going to try a bunch of different strategies, and one's going to work, but we're going to keep the ones that work, then can replicate that the full range of strategies that are being used. Um,
Gordy, I'm gonna interject something really quickly that's probably
Okay.
related to the slide. That is that if indeed we are facing a rapidly warming climate and a rising sea level, um, perhaps the only really practical aspiration for long-term coho conservation is life history diversity, and that's just a
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't argue with that in the least. In fact, I was just going to point out is that, the future and the amount of variation we're going to be seeing in the future, it's probably going to dwarf what we see now. And it and so, to think that we can just keep um, we can just simply increase numbers of fish, I think it's not a winning strategy. We've got to be able to create a landscape that provide for the expression of the diversity of life history diversity. And so I would say go big or go home. I mean, that's how we have to think about moving forward here as we try to meet these challenges. Okay, the first thing is we got to think about the entire network. Okay, we can't just be doing these thinking about isolated pockets. I think this work from Sean Brennan and Daniel Schindler in Bristol Bay illustrates that very nicely. There's small things happen. A stream gets blocked by a landslide. A spring goes dry. Whatever happened in these landscapes to change things. Um, this is, you need the entire landscape to allow this expression, the entire network. for this expression of life history type to occur. And to think that we just do small snippets in a given watershed, in a given spot, I think it, I don't want to, this is hard because people have been doing this, because we thought this is the way we should. And I don't, this is not meant to be a commentary on saying that their work was not important. It was. We learned from it. But I think we're at a critical point where we've got to ask ourselves, is it really the right way to keep going and make adjustments and maybe make some changes? The other thing is we have to think about redundancy in the network. Okay. Often, and I think that's particularly important down here. Um, because we're not going to be able in probably the vast majority of places, we're not going to have an entire landscape we're able to have those fish depend on. And so we've got to be able to build redundancy into the landscape so that if one spot is not productive for a given year, the fish can move somewhere else or shift somewhere else across that landscape. So building redundancy into into our conservation plans is going to be absolutely critical. Okay, and just give you some ideas. This is of what I mean by this is okay. This is the Northwest projection. I'm assuming most people are familiar with Northwest, which is the Dan Isaac's, projections of future water temperatures that he did. And, one of the things is most of us see the Northwest projections, you see these maps that are, like regional or maps or sub-regional maps, and they all look like they're really quite, well, it's not an optimistic picture, let's put it that way. But when you take those downscaled projections, which are in the Northwest, and start to look at them, there's a tremendous amount of variability. And when you're looking here, I mean, is that, there's going to be places that are going to warm, but there's a lot of places in the landscape that aren't. And so that aren't necessarily going to warm to the same degree for a number of different reasons. And the idea is we need to be strategic, and as we start to think about the redundancy, about where we're going to go to do things, and not just just do things where we necessarily can, but think about being more strategic and doing things where it's going to make a difference ecologically. And here's an example of these dark red areas are areas where if we were going to if you were going to look at areas that were influenced, where water temperature was influenced by the stream adjacent riparian areas, it would be these red areas, okay? And it has to do with the aspect of the stream and a whole host of other things. But the idea is if we're going to go out and do restoration under the guise of trying to address climate change, you can see it with this type of analysis that you do it strategically, and you don't necessarily just have to do it everywhere. You do it in certain places. And again, I think that's going to be the key, and we have to do this across the landscape in these key places to probably get the biggest bang for our bucks. Okay. We are going to, and we're going to have to respond to things like fires and floods. They're going to continue to happen, setting up the landscape so that there's positive changes happen, or we can have positive responses from these are going to be critical. So one of the things is going to be connectivity, the longitudinal. I mean, I know there's a lot of this goes on. We're replacing culverts with bridges. We've got tide gates, but we need to do it so that um, the whole network is available for these fish to use. Okay, and that includes not just these small streams, but this larger stream. But we got to really think about the small streams as well, and also about the connectivity in a lateral way. The off-channel habitat, because I'll show you an example here about why that's important. But reconnecting these floodplains, so particularly if we're concerned and we want to deal with life history diversity, reconnecting the lateral and the channels laterally, both in terms of cold water and available habitat during the winter, is absolutely paramount to making, to dealing with the challenges we're going to face moving forward. And we can, again, being very strategic where we go to do this. Lee talked about NetMap as a very good tool to start to be able to do that type of thing. Okay. And again, all of this is a focus on diversity. I think diversity has to become our 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 absolute um, number one goal in terms of conservation. It no longer can just be fish numbers. Increasing the life history diversity and providing a landscaping where that life history diversity can be expressed is going to be is key moving forward. Okay, one of the things that it's really interesting to me how we go out and we rally around numbers. We can count the number of dead spawners and stuff. But there's a record out there, an incredible record in every one of those fish of what that fish did every day of its life. And and we just leave it. We leave it out there. We've got to be I would argue that if we're going to start to understand diversity and make it a goal, we as part of our monitoring effort, we shouldn't just be counting fish. We should be looking at the diversity within it and using otoliths to as a way to do it. This is just an example from some work in Puget Sound, just looking at different uh, population in their life history. Where you got you see the fall Chinook here. The first two, you notice that the maternal resident, they've got a high strontium calcium ratio. So that suggests the eggs are developed in salt water. You get down to a spring Chinook, you notice the maternal origin there is uh, the strontium calcium ratio is really low. The eggs develop in freshwater, so there's some really good insights here. And then you look at the freshwater residency, that extended residency of these river type fish versus the ocean type. So being able to understand what the population we're trying to conserve, what they do, and it should be really a key to moving forward. And then how let me back up here a second. This diversity. This is work again from Dan Bottom and Kim Jones and others on the Salmon River, where they were, and this was a total surprise. This was not. I think this is one of the really cool research situations where you learn something you didn't expect. But the idea was here is they took out dikes, tidal dikes, in the lower part of the river, and what they saw was life history types of these are of coho, life history types that they hadn't seen before just by taking out tidal dike. These are fish that now, instead of having to move straight through to the ocean, could spend time moving into the laterally into these floodplains and grow more before they hit the ocean. So it appears that if we provide the opportunities for life history type to be expressed, it can happen quite quickly and be a really important thing. Now, one of the interesting things I think is thinking about steel.
Gordy, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah,
along that story of build it and they will come,
yeah,
there's a person who's going to be here tonight. They couldn't make it because of weather. They working on sockeye in central Idaho that spawn at 7,000 feet, 700
yeah.
miles from saltwater. And there was a sunbeam dam that was a complete block to anadromy for 30 years on the main salmon. And you pull the dam, and now you have anadromous sockeye again. So
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
anyway,
yeah. I mean, the ability of these fish to retain that memory, if you will, of what they needed to do is incredible. I mean, here's an example of steelhead and rainbows. Steelhead and rainbows are not the different fish. They're just they're life history types on a continuum. From anadromous individuals to fully resident individuals. And um, think about, we're putting a tremendous amount of effort into trying to restore steelhead. What do we know about the relationship between these two? Mike Bluen done some really, who's the geneticist at OSU, done some really cool work on Hood River, where he found that 45% of the steelhead that returned to Hood River had at least one resident parent.
Wow. That's crazy.
That's crazy. How much of our restoration efforts for steelhead do we focus on the resident portion of the population? We have, and I remember we worked for years up on Fish Creek up off the Clackamas, and they would, springtime, the spring trout season would open, and people would be out there just yarding, quote, these quote rainbow trout, right? Um, and I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it's just like, wow, that was really crazy. We're trying to restore these populations. That this life history type really is what we're trying to do. But we're actually, having a significant impact on the on the potential source of recovery. And so very few, I would say, there's all kind of effort going in creating habitat quote for steelhead, but we're not creating habitat for the rainbow. These small streams that will, or we have rules and regulations that don't protect them. And so I think it's really critical, again, that we start to think differently about what we're doing in conservation. And thinking about the entire landscape and life history diversity, I would argue, is where we need to go. And again, I'm not trying to say what we've done is wrong, what we've done in the past or what we're doing currently is necessarily wrong. We've learned, and that's what science is all about. We learn, we adjust, and we move forward. And I would argue we're in a point where we need to adjust and move forward in a different direction. So with that, I will end this and entertain any questions or comments.
Gordy, your comments sound familiar to the commentary on that Rick Williams and Jim Likatowicz in the recent book posthumously published by Jim, Managed Extinction, where they argue that you need to manage at the watershed scale because that's what the fish use in the entire watershed. That's what we found out in the Salmon River is that look at what's missing and the ability to express those multiple life history stages and opening up the estuarine portion that was 75% blocked and is no longer.
Yeah.
Really helped. And when they shut down the hatchery, it even demonstrated that they could maintain that diversity with the portfolio approach rather than the single hatchery production.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ken.
Gordy, I won't say it's a pushback exactly, but as a board member on a watershed council in the Nehalem Basin, this is a very much of a working basin, and we have some of the most intensive and productive forestry on Earth. We have some very intensive and productive agricultural landscapes at the lower end of the basin, and that supports working families. I won't apologize for platforming some ideas I've kicked around, but I really like the idea you're talking about because you're talking about we need to have the entire landscape working. And I'm going to push back and say you don't have to have all the landscape working. You just have to have some part of all of the landscape working. And so one of the things that I've been sort of waving my hand about with the people who at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and within our basin partnership and saying, our strategic action plan is really based upon a stronghold vision of salmon. And I believe that like religion when I graduated from college in 1986. I belonged to Oregon trout and wild salmon and but right now we have dairies down here who hold the keys to the gate, right? They do not particularly like us. They don't particularly want to work with us. And as someone who makes my living in agriculture, I actually have a working understanding of the economics of loss of productive acres that some of these families face. These guys could be sitting on $1 million to $2 million worth of real estate, and they're living on $35,000 a year. And so when we as conservationists come to them, we need to bring with us rational economic compensation. And this the only I don't believe the only option should be a buyout and retiring from agriculture. I think the buyout should be carving out key areas within working farms and turning those areas into summer refugia for estuary life history. And there's very little perception that that's a priority, and there really don't exist funding or even conservation models for that. So, but essentially the idea that if you give them room, and they don't have to have the whole place, they just have to have a little bit of room and a little bit of cold water, and I think it can go a long way. But I'll shut up and see if anyone has any other comments or if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I do. I mean, and I think you're exactly right. And the way Jim Siddell, Jim and I talked about this forever, and I wish Jimmy was still here to be part of this.
Here.
Yeah. You think about it, it's strings on pearls on a string is how we have to think about this. We're not going to take over the entire landscape. And we need to be very strategic and be able to show why this particular piece of ground can be important or that particular ground should be important. And I think that's why these analyses are important, and this idea of focusing on what does the life history diversity need to be expressed. They need to have some refugia at a key point in the basin. And we start to work with people in showing them strategically what we have to do and showing them that this isn't, you got to stop doing everything you've done type of thing,
Right.
And it's going to be the same, truth be told, between the ag interest and private forestry, they hold the key to the recovery of coho.
Absolutely.
And so how do we work with them? How do we incentivize them to participate in a conservation program? Not continue. I'm not going to get in my soapbox about the private forest accord. Not continuing to lock up more land.
Agree.
We need to think about how do we incentivize people and how do we convince them that this is a key thing that needs to be done. And
Gordy, I'm going to jump in and say on the farms we have there's a model for Nature Conservancy doing some amazing work over in Tillamook, incredible work. They bought some property and they're doing just everything a conservationist would want for estuary restoration, and they're working on about 500 acres. And I believe there's also some land banking going on where you can give them $100,000 and there'll be a permanent reserve and you can, do something here. But for my money, I would rather have 500 acres distributed over 5,000 acres. And of agriculture, whereby we are producing shade on these tiny little goofy little creeks where there's cold water refugia in the summer than on one 500-acre parcel. And when you look at the analysis been done about thermal loading and modeling this, and there's a publication from the Skagit. at some extraordinary, almost order of magnitude percentage, the best way to get the heat out of water on the Skagit is to plant trees on agricultural land.
Yeah.
Hands down. You can spend here to eternity tweaking your forest management and you're moving the needle this much. And you go plant trees on, on agricultural land where there's no shade and there's an estuary life history that can access that small stream. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
So the problem is there's money on one side, although maybe not as much as, 4 months ago. And there's people who are rationally concerned about their livelihood, particularly in agricultural landscapes. And if we can figure out how to compensate them rationally, and honestly, I've heard comments from conservation communities, frustrated that farmers won't take $100 to $200 an acre to retire their land, and it's mind-boggling. I mean, it's just there's a disconnect in terms of um the 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 what those families are doing to try and make a living on those
Yeah.
small dairies.
Yeah.
So
Well,
and so until we focus those sort of resources in a rational way on compensating the people who hold the keys to the gate, we're not going to have, I think, the landscape diversity that we require.
yeah, and I think partly part of this is that explaining to people we don't need everything everywhere.
Right.
That we've got to we have to have pieces spread out in key locations.
We need something everywhere.
We need something everywhere, right? Well, we need something in key location. Let's put
Right. Yeah.
across that network, along that network.
Yeah.
And look for the opportunity to do that. And then, how do we incentivize people to participate, not force them? You
No.
know, what are the incentives to participate in this? And this is the contribution you're going to make, and if we can show people that this particular piece of ground is strategically really critical and can do that and can make this contribution, I think we can start to get away from, you have to do everything everywhere type of thing. And that
Right.
might,
Or you have to do everything perfectly, right?
yeah, yeah.
Not so anyway, thank you. Sorry,
Okay,
sorry to intrude so much.
Gordy, this is Rob.
Yeah.
So, with the prospect of diminishing funds in the future, what tools do we have to try to do what you're talking about? How do we find the right places, and what do we do there?
I think there's analyses that are done, have been done. As an example, just before I retired, I got money from the Washington office of the Forest Service to do those downscale climate change projections for that I showed some examples of Norwest. As part of that, we did the entire we did those downscale projections. We ended up identifying where riparian areas were critical for temperature. We identified landslide prone areas. We identified, off-channel habitats on every acre of land from the Cascades to the coast, up to, I think it was the northern part of the Siuslaw. We did it for $30,000, and then that analysis is available to anybody. Okay. Um, and then the Forest Service came back and said, okay, let's complete the rest of the state. So we did it all the way to the Columbia, and we did it to east to Hood River. And so these downscaled projections with all that analysis are available right now for anybody if you ask the Forest Service for it. The Forest Service didn't, part of the thing is the Forest Service didn't want to use it because then they would, with landslides, for example, if we said this is the most landslide prone channel, if they have that information beforehand and then there's a landslide and they didn't deal with it beforehand, they could be in trouble. So they just basically got it and put it in the drawer. One of my fears is it's going to go away here quickly. Um, unless somebody gets it.
Gordy and Rob, I'm gonna throw something out here, which is that one of the questions that I think that we face in the coast, and I think we're quite a little ways from actually tackling it, is where should we spend our dollars? And so when we do conservation in one place, we're not doing conservation in another place. And if we have a some prefix ideas about what we should do and where, and we're not having ongoing analytics and exploring new questions, we run the risk of spending our dollars in places that have the less rather than more effect. And so one of the analytical things that I think we need is to be able to look at a dollar spent on a log in an anchor habitat, which I support, and I think that's a good thing, compared to a dollar spent on acquiring conservation easements within a working farm. How do we balance those values? And we can't do that in terms of a dollar for dollar uh, basis yet. And we did not do that with our strategic action plan. Those sort of calculations were embedded in there, they weren't explicitly articulated. And a reevaluation of those are not a part of the adaptive management components of our strategic action plan.
Um,
I mean, I just think, that what we have to come to the recognition is that some places are more important than others.
Yep.
And that's a hard thing to do because there's a lot of people with really good intentions and they want to contribute. But the truth be told is not every place has an equal potential to contribute.
Right.
And we're getting to the point where we've got to be much more strategic and get to the the places that have a greater potential than ones that with less potential. And that's a hard.
Gordy, our planning, that concept is embedded in our planning, and I'm not sure we kind of got over the hill in terms of our analysis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll give you an example, and I'm not going to name names, but I was asked to go out with a governor and his natural resource advisor with Norm Johnson and Jim Siddell. And we drove around the Coast Range for an entire day. And at the end of the day, they said, "What would you recommend?" And he said, "Well, you've got $1 to give to, for salmon conservation. Somebody's going to get 80 cents of that money. And someone, the other people might get 2 cents." He said, "We can't do that. That's politically unacceptable."
Right.
And so the reality is we're probably spending money in places where the return is not nearly as potentially great. And how do we overcome that? That's a social political issue.
Well, I would argue it's also an analytic issue. So in other words, the to produce an analytical framework that is widely accepted among the conservation community is that's not on the table right now. That's perceived to have been done, and we have an answer and we're working on it within boundaries. But that's right. So in other words, there's people get on trains, and we need to be always, we need to be rebuilding our rail lines as we go, and that's a hard thing to do within these systems of conservation, but it's a worthy goal.
Uh-huh. But I just think it's important that we recognize that we've got to change our objective and our approach. We've got to be thinking, big and the pearls on the string type of approach, and we've got to be thinking about life history diversity. If we continue just to, move ahead and try to produce, as many fish as we can, it might look like we're making some progress, but I would contend that doesn't bode well for the future.
Well, I would say this, our organization is not a numbers-oriented organization. We're a habitat-oriented organization. And I'm guessing most people in the room are, but your point is well taken. And, the politics of salmon conservation is, you go down here to the bay and, the value of someone driving down from Portland and being able to bring a salmon home to their family is sort of an inestimable cultural import and political import. And so to have some harvest and have some reliable harvest is so attractive, and it's not going away politically.
Right.
And and we need to start stitching together some of the pearls in the string that we haven't been stitching together as effectively. Um, Go ahead, Zach.
Oh, to that note, I'm thinking about for instance, earlier in the board meeting, I was talking about um an opportunity that's come up for funding that I'm planning to write for. And, you know, my thought so far has been, okay, here's an opportunity to address a lot of habitat and just concentrate it all in one sixth field. But I'm sitting here thinking about that map that you were sharing from up in Alaska with the year over year productivity changes in the different stream systems. And part of me is wondering, um, okay, how much of that is due to yeah, that's the one right there, right? Like how much of that variability is happening because there's been disturbances in the different locations, and so now certain areas are better or are more suitable or less suitable than they were previously, and how much of that is um factors that we're not even aware of, because if it's kind of, you know, almost stochastic, right? Like kind of like a roll of the dice every year of which areas are going to be hotspots, then instead of concentrating in one sixth field, I should be looking at doing projects spread out all across the basin with this one particular pot of money, rather than focusing on intensive work all in one concentrated area, apart from the logistic benefits of that, which are
Yeah.
availability of wood supply and having all the machinery in one place, right? Um, but I'm wondering if I'm missing the point here a little bit,
Well,
or if I'm getting close to it.
well, no. I think you're onto something. And what I would say is, part of this is there's some major disturbances, a flood or something that happens. But there's also small things that happen. A landslide happens somewhere, or, you know, the idea is we expect things, oh, that's got three pieces of wood and two pools and whatever else it needs.
Right.
And it's good, and we pat ourselves on the back and we walk away from it. We don't but the truth be told, like I showed, with the Elk River example with the fish moving and tracking things. They're moving around, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so things are not stable. As much as we want to wire the, cable the logs in and put boulders and whatever else we do with them. Um, that isn't how the world works. And and this is it's highly variable. And I think this is a good example of small things that and I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at all of the what happened in each of these years about major fluctuations. But the point is, the fish had a landscape they could return to, in which they had spots they could go to. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's how we have to think about it. Have we built a landscape that has the redundancy in it so that the population can persist, and that instead of just focusing just in one sixth field, maybe you do the same thing. You think about the pearls on the string in
Mm-hmm.
4 6 fields.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a better strategy than putting it all your eggs into one basket. But recognize that this is how things work. It's not stable. As much as we want it to be stable, as much as we want things to be predictable, it's not. The ocean isn't predictable. The freshwater environment isn't predictable. And how do you allow a species that is basically adapted to disturbance to persist? You do it by creating a landscape in which it can use its strategy, which is life history diversity.
Mhm.
So Zach, so imagine this. So if you picture a list of every anchor habitat in the Nehalem,
Now I can picture
and
it.
right, I know you've studied it much harder than I have,
Yeah.
and I'm going to throw this out here. Some of those anchor habitats have more temporal stability than others,
Hmm.
and I don't know. I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but I suspect that there's places that could be anchor habitats that are not based upon
100%.
temporality, right?
Yeah. Oh
And
yeah.
so one of the things we're not quite allowed to do is say, hey, this is a possible anchor habitat over here. We want to go work on that because actually it looks pretty easy and relatively affordable to go work on this anchor habitat. That might be riparian forestry that's going to kick in 40 years, right? It might be some logs, whatever that is. Um, and so, but that idea is some of those anchor habitats have high temporal stability and some have low temporal stability, and that's sort of that temporality is not a component we've incorporated into our conservation planning, and more is the shame, I'd say. And so that's something that we can be thinking about and working on. And I have some ideas I've run by you and talked to Gordy
Hmm.
about if we can get the funding to do sort of some advanced dynamic analytics, these things kind of get really pretty easy in a hurry. But
Well,
we need.
and it raises a bit of a question of how often should we be reconsidering which areas are our priority areas to work in because of the temporality. Um, there's also the question of what's the time scale on which that temporality is changing, right?
Right.
Are these areas going to remain good places to work for 10, 20 years and be effective places to work for 20 years and then we should be reassessing then? Or is it more that they're good places to work for 10 years
Right.
and
Well,
then or
well,
50
the clock
years?
the clock's running on every log we put in the river, and the number I've heard
Oh,
is 30 years,
entirely. Entirely.
right? And
Yeah,
Steve Trask, who knows more than any of us about it, says we're running out of logs. In fact, we're kind of out of logs, which is
Yeah.
why he's been trying to innovate beaver dam analogs, which are
Yeah.
a cool idea. I haven't seen places where they've gone in where there's beaver food yet, particularly much.
And I
But
don't
that's
think the
another
point for
question.
Steve is beaver. For
What's
Steve, the
that?
point for Steve, the point of the beaver dam analog isn't necessarily the beaver, it's the
Right.
ponded habitat.
Yeah,
But
it's like how do you create the opportunity to create that habitat?
yeah.
I'm kind of the weirdo who's like, what do we have? Like, okay, let's just say we have more money than God and we can put logs everywhere we want to, and they're going to be gone. If we took us 20 years to do it, they're going to be gone. On some distribution of decay.
Hmm.
Where are the next logs coming from? And we do not have an understanding of that return from our riparian forests. And there's a lot of reasons to think that they're not going to do the job given the preponderance of alder in the Nehalem.
Hmm.
And we're going to be seeing declining thermal protection from the canopies and a lack of conifer recruitment, which is disturbing. So I know that Gordy's been examining some of these questions in the Elliott, and I'm sure Rob's been thinking about some of that stuff. And we're going to keep scratching away at what we're doing. But
well, I just want to say just make one comment on Zach's what you said. The
Yeah.
fo the focus should not be on logs. It should be on restoring the ecological processes that that you generate the next generation of logs. And and so what that means is we've got to get into previously managed riparian areas and do some pretty, in many cases, some pretty extensive activities. Now that's been a no-no. That's been, I mean, trying to get in, 7 years I worked on the HCP for the Elliott, and we got permission to do it on 160 acres,
That's it.
it's part of the early part of the HCP. So that's going to be a major focus.
Okay.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
research on the Elliott is how
Dave,
you do that. But
before we
I just and I know Rob's here and about the beaver. I've had the good fortune, as I've talked about it, is to work on the Copper River Delta, which has the highest concentration of beavers in North America. And I can tell you, those dams are not stable for any length of time. 3 or 4 years. and then the beavers either eat themselves out of house and home and move. And what's really interesting, you'll see areas where you had a beaver dam. It was an incredibly productive rearing pond. The dam breaks, the beavers move, they build a dam somewhere else. What was rearing habitat becomes spawning habitat. What was, yeah, and what was spawning habitat becomes rearing habitat. And cycle of things that they move. It moved across the landscape, and you see this everywhere. So the idea, again, these are short term. They're important in the short term, but the long term, it's like reestablishing the processes, and that's something we don't do well as part of our conservation plan because we want instant results. You
Yeah.
know, and so if we're not going to, I mean, if you read the resilience literature, this is all about ecological resilience versus engineering resilience. Right now we're in an engineering resilience mindset, and it's a costly in terms of you have to have a lot of money because you have to go in and constantly re redo things. If we thought about things from an ecological resilience, we'd be out there trying to reestablish ecological processes as part of our restoration efforts.
Rob, you had a comment. I think you didn't quite.
I was actually I was going to ask Gordy if he can tell us what's the future of the HCP.
Don't know. I didn't get signed before Biden left the White House. Um, I, I mean, what's the future of NIMS? Much less the HCP.
Right.
I don't know, Rob. I honestly don't know. I mean, we worked really diligently with NIMS to get permission to do this active restoration work, and I think that it would be a shame if we lose that potential.
Thank you. Right. I agree.
On a completely different note for a second, can you give us the name of that Forest Service analysis you were talking about earlier?
It's the downscaled northwest projections, and I would get a hold. We'll talk about it quietly after. I don't want to say anything in public. Okay.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And
Give me a call we'll talk about how to get it.
that sounds good. Yeah, and so Sophie in the chat here, connect with me and we'll figure out how to get you a copy.
Yeah, well, if you get a hold of the regional office of the 4th Region 6 and ask them for the downscaled projections, they have it in the regional office. They have all of those records in the regional office. And if that doesn't work, let me know.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And Gordy, just circling back on your comment about ecological processes and restoration of ecological processes, the things that come to my mind when I think about that and the Nehalem, I think shade and cooler water on the small streams, which are summer refugia in the estuary, because there's not a lot of spawning recruitment there, but there's potential for a lot of fish to hide from hot water in the summer. And I think about natural wood recruitment. And I think that we have riparian forests that are wildly different from any forest that's existed there probably since the end of the last ice age. So end of the last ice age, this part of the world looked like Montana. There's a lot less wood. It was very dry and cold. And there still would have been more wood in those riparian systems. So we scrubbed our riparian systems from nurse logs. And that's how you grow conifers and riparian zones around here, is on nurse logs. And we are wildly impoverished with respect to nurse logs, and we're wildly impoverished in my view, and we're trying to get the numbers to determine whether that's an erroneous opinion or accurate. What are we actually recruiting for conifers in our protected areas? We don't know the answer, and we assume that the protected areas will sufficiently recruit conifers to restore a natural wood recruitment. I think that is a wildly naive and optimistic premise for conservation in the basin. And hopefully we can hopefully some of the work we're doing here will answer that question. I hope I'm wrong. That would be nice. But it could be that one of the biggest things we should be doing in the Nehalem is riparian forestry.
Well, and again, this is going to be hopefully be a real focus of the Elliott. But you know, so you look at John Tapner and Nathan Pogue have done some really good work looking at riparian forest in the coast, and what you see, the biggest trees that they can find in riparian areas are develop at very low stocking densities, really close to the stream. That's where those really big pumpkins
Yep.
come from in the riparian areas. And so we've got to get into these riparian areas and do some pretty heavy thinnings. It's not just a uniform thinning through in the riparian areas, but
Right.
again, strategically doing the right things in the right, doing certain things in the right place to take advantage of the situation. And again, I think it just points out is that we've got to be much more strategic in what we do where than just, because something presents an opportunity to do it, doesn't necessarily mean that we should do it. That we've got to be strategic. We've got to be, for a number of different reasons. But I think getting people just to step, like to step back and say, okay, let's just take a deep breath and figure out where can we go, and where's the pearl, that pearl need to be placed in that network, and then within that, where are the places that we can go to get the biggest bang for our effort that are going to give it in the long term be the most productive.
Which is premised on having an explicit statement of the key process that you're trying to promote.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I think we do a lot of identification of pearls, but we don't connect it to the process, and sometimes we miss. We get a little misdirection.
Yep. Yep.
Well, I think that's an excellent note to close out on, unless anybody has any more questions or thoughts they want to share.
I want to thank Gordy very much. Thank you, sir.
You're more than welcome, Rob. Good to see you.
You too.
Really great presentation. Really quickly, I was wondering if you could just slide back a couple of slides for me. I didn't quite get enough time to keep going. It was back and it showed either the Pacific Northwest or just Oregon. And it was a map showing the
I think you went over it, maybe not.
that right here. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is coastal Oregon.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I was just didn't quite get enough time to interpret it. So thank you for going back. Really great job.
Yeah, this was from a project that called CLAM, Coastal Landscape Analysis and Modeling Study, and this is all on the web in the College of Forestry. But it was an outgrowth of people who worked on the Northwest Forest Plan and were frustrated. We went home pissed and moaned, and we eventually got some money to think about how we would, if we were really, going to do it, how we would think about things. And this is Mike Wimberly's work where he modeled fire and looked at what the Coast Range looked like historically.
Mm.
Very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
It's not how most people see the world.
No, 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 no. I'm just saying is that, when you start looking at the, at this landscape, not so long ago, it was anything but stable. It was a dynamic place. And the reason we have anadromous fish with all this diversity is not because of stability. It was because of how dynamic this place was. That's the only way you can make it in this part of the world. You have to have diversity.
And if we try and shoehorn those fish into a static model and a low temporality static model, there's a high likelihood of failure.
Oh, I think, again, this is not, I don't want this to come across as saying that, what people have done isn't good or wasn't good. we have to bring in this new knowledge, this new understanding, and say, okay, what we did, let's try a different way of approaching this problem, and this issue, and move away from what we've been doing and try something different. Because I think it's pretty clear that we're not going to gain the potential for success going the way we're going. It is low at this point.
Great. Well, thank you, Gordy, so much for this. This was really interesting for me, and I think for everybody else here too. And so I really appreciate you making the time. Sorry we couldn't have you out in person today.
Yeah.
Thanks to, you know, this nice little storm we're having, but hopefully you can make it out again in the near future.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're going to put a recording of this up, and we're going to actually try to develop some additional products based on this sort of these themes that will eventually hopefully get out and widely available.
Yeah, exactly. So this recording will be on YouTube by probably Monday or Tuesday of next week. And then future products based off of it will be out as they're produced. So thank you again so much, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.